Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our next panel discussion at this year's Berlin Foreign Policy Forum on taxes, tariffs, trade agreements. For the start, let me quote outgoing Commission President Juncker. He called upon Europe in 2008 to develop Weltpolitikfähigkeit. So this is one word in German. It translates into 10 words in English. The capacity to play a role in shaping global affairs. The debate about the necessary reforms within the European Union for Europe to become a global power are in full swing, at latest since the Macron's proposals in the Sorbonne proposals by Macron. However, and this is something that Amélie de Montchalin, the State Minister for European Affairs, has argued in the Berlin Pulse, our foreign policy publication, that Germany's reaction to these proposals has not explicitly been enthusiastic. Is Germany dragging its feet when it comes to reform in the European Union? This is a question we want to ask you before we start with the panel. You have now the opportunity to do one more live voting. Please take your device, and also the speakers are also cordially invited if they wish so. Minister Scholz. So we are not tracking who votes which results. So the question we want to ask you is, who has done more for the future of the EU? Easy question, first answer, Emmanuel Macron. Second, Angela Merkel. Please press the button. You just don't have to press enter, just the button 1 or 2, and it starts now, 10 seconds. Donald Trump is a proposal from the audience? Good. We'll need a couple of questions and then we will get the results from the audience. 73%. Our French friends, and I know that there's some in the audience. We apologize, this is the view of this audience. But let me tell you that this view is actually not very different to the view of the German public. We've asked the same question to the German public in our representative survey in the Berlin Pulse, and the result was actually not that strong, but it was still 56% for Angela Merkel and 17% for Emmanuel Macron. So let us hear what our panelists think, whether they agree with this opinion in the audience and also with the German public opinion. It is a great honor to welcome such a distinguished panel. We have with us Olaf Scholz, Federal Minister for Finance and German Vice Chancellor. We have with us Nadia María Calviño Santamaría, the Acting Minister of Economy and Business of Spain. We also welcome Paschal Donohoe, the Irish Minister for Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform, as well as Sabine Weyand, Director-General for Trade from the European Commission. And the discussion will be moderated by our colleague Nora Müller, Executive Director in the International Affairs Department at Körber-Stiftung. You can contribute questions with the hashtag Berlin Forum. And now, dear panelists, the stage is yours.
Everyone got their place. Dear guests, welcome and good afternoon to a session that we always internally called the Scholz and Friends session. 1 hour of geo-economics as seen from Berlin, but also from Brussels, from Dublin, and from Madrid. Now, to get us into the mood, let me give you a line, in fact, by Benjamin Franklin, who once said, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. For the Eurozone, that means taxes, and more specifically, a unified tax regime are an issue yet again. And as Liana already mentioned, the bigger question looming larger here is, what does European sovereignty actually mean in the realm of fiscal policy and also in the financial domain? So let's hear from our panelists, and I wanted to start with Minister Calviño, who is in all likelihood, going to be part of Spain's new coalition government, a coalition between the socialist and the far-left Podemos party. Now, the Forbes magazine recently asked, who's afraid of Spain's first left-wing coalition government? And I wanted to ask you, Minister, should we be afraid? And more precisely, should we be afraid of excessive spending with regard to the new government?
Well, definitely not, of course, because we have been for the last 17 months leading a government which was a socialist party government, but supported by Podemos, which has followed a three-pronged economic policy strategy based, first of all, on fiscal responsibility, reducing our public deficit and public debt to GDP ratios as fast as possible. Secondly, social sensitivity. We need to reduce the inequalities which have grown so much in Spain in the last 10 years. And then thirdly, an ambitious agenda of structural reforms to ensure that growth continues to be as sustainable as possible into the future, also from the environmental point of view. We have followed this three-pronged strategy. These will be the main lines of our economic policy going forward. And this has been done with a government which was basically led by, as I was saying, the same parties that would be at the core of the coalition. So evidence shows that these are objectives that should be pursued. I am a bit jumping the gun of my colleagues, but I think these challenges are common to all our European countries. And there is nothing very different from the recommendations of the international institutions. And what I have seen is that international markets have marked their trust in our system. Sovereign debt markets are behaving very well. And therefore, I think that this is an agenda which has proven to be positive and that we should be following in pursuing in the future.
Positive and feasible also, but it seems to me that, you know, achieving all those goals that you just put on the table, that's really squaring the circle a little bit, no?
Well, I think that we don't have any alternative, to be very frank. I mean, I don't think that we have to follow a path of fiscal responsibility, that's for sure. We all lived the crisis. Of course, Paschal and I come from countries that suffered it firsthand. So we know how important it is to have a responsible fiscal policy, but at the same time, we have to run our governments thinking of citizens, putting citizens at the heart of what we do. If we don't tackle inequalities, one day we're going to wake up seeing that extremism and nationalism is taking over our political systems. We're starting to see it even in Spain. So I think that this is a challenge which is common to all of us. We will need to make ends meet, and these two forms of sustainability to be compatible.
This is a challenge coming to all of us. Minister Scholz, you just tabled a draft budget for 2020. It's 360 billion euro, out of which roughly 40 billion are earmarked for investments. You said German fiscal policy is going expensive in the sense of expanding it. The opposition says it's too little, too late. So I wanted to ask you the unavoidable question in a way. How long can you stick to the policy of the Black Zero?
If you are leading an opposition party or speaking for them, you have to first learn the sentence too little, too late. This is the way for an opposition party to give good words about the government.
Okay, granted.
And so I'm very happy about all these nice comments. The reality is that really we are managing a very expansionary fiscal policy, and this is also something you can see looking at the budget. This is the same in the last 2 years, but it is especially due if you look at this budget we now will decide on in the Parliament in the end of the week for the next year. And this is part of a strategy we have for the next 10 years. Looking at the decades to come, you will see it's, if we just stick to the ordinary plannings of investment, it will be more than 400 billion euros of investment within the 10 years. But adding all these plans we made to tackle climate change, it will be an extra 150 billion euros. So it's nearly between 550 to 600 billion euros, which will be spent as public investments from the federal budget.
With a balanced budget.
With a balanced budget, as far as we can understand. And it is absolutely necessary that we look at Germany not just from the federal level, because we are governed in a completely different way as many other countries. There is also the 16 states who have their own taxes, their own incomes, and their own spending. And there is all these more than 11,000 municipalities in Germany which have their own income and their own spending. And this altogether is Germany investing. So it is not a really remarkable message for the rest of the world when I tell you that we changed the constitution for giving us the ability to support the municipalities in building schools. It's 3.5 billion which we are now putting into that. But usually we are never paid a single euro because it's a traditional task of the municipalities and supported by the 16 states. So in looking at that, it's really a great message because it's something which was very important for us. This is the same if we look, for instance, at affordable housing. We changed the constitution that from the federal level we can support it, and we will do in the next decade to make it more easy for municipalities and states to invest into affordable housing, which is a big task for the future, and especially the growing metropolises and the cities who are successful in the economic circle. And the biggest task will be that we meet the social cohesion questions, which are important also in our country. We have to avoid that some people think that it's not about them. So we have to finance the pension scheme. We have to increase the pensions for those having very low pensions. And we did so. We increased support for children. We increased support for families, working families with low income and children. We increased the support for students. We increased the support for those who need some extra money for housing. Just to give you an idea, we made it feasible to have tax reliefs as you look at the next year. It will be altogether, looking from the starting point of this government, 25 billion a year less than before, and it will mostly supporting those who have less and middle incomes. And then there is this big task of climate change, which I already mentioned, which will be a lot of investment and a big change in our tax regime, because we will increase taxes on fossil energy and the use of it, and we will decrease uses which are more helpful for the environment.
You made a very convincing argument, Minister, that Germany is investing more into all sorts of things, and still there are people who say this is not enough. This is also not enough to avert a possible economic crisis that is somewhere looming large. By the way, including your predecessor, Wolfgang Schäuble, the architect of the Black Zero, who also seems to believe that now is the time for a paradigm shift. So what are your thoughts on this one?
First, we increased the spending, and we did that much that we are not very sure that we will be able to get all the money out to the streets and the railways and things that should be invested. So this is the more important question, how we can remodel our planning procedures and decision-making processes, and how we can convince the building industry, the infrastructure and construction industry, that they invest more into their capacities. We have a demand which we cannot feed, which is something very important. And I'm absolutely angry that though we have a very all-time high in investment in all the construction sites, may it be infrastructure, may it be houses, may it be something else, that there has been no increase. So all the European industry willing to serve the German market can do so, and they do in many cases, but still there is a demand that cannot be served. There are always people telling that they have to ask for a new, look for new people to do it, that they have to wait for 1 or 2 years for someone that will do the work. And this is, on the one hand, no crisis. On the other hand, it is a failing market structure, that there is no investment into bigger capacities. Yeah.
Your applause, Minister. I didn't mean to cut that one short. Minister Donohoe, moving a little bit away from sort of the domestic issue of the Black Zero in Germany, your country, Ireland, is really very much a poster child when it comes to economic recovery. You're good at growth, you have your employment situation under control, so is your debt. And one thing that you're also part of is a new club, which is called the New Hanseatic League. And some people say that one of the main goals of this club is really to step on the brakes when it comes to all sorts of Franco-German ideas for Eurozone integration. So is that what your membership of this club is all about? How would you describe the idea behind it?
So I think it's very important when we're looking at what is a group of countries that have some ideas in common, not to also overstate the difference that we have with other members of the European Union. I have far more in common with Nadia and Olaf than I will ever have in difference with them. And in many ways, this little group coming together is just a response back to two things within the European Union. The first one is the early reaction to the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, and the fact that ideas that they were sometimes very vocal champions of do have value, and other countries agree with them, and we need to look at how those ideas can still be projected. And the other point is that we have many other alliances that are generated by geography, by history, that, for example, Ireland would be near but not part of. So this league, I think, would be very much overstating it. It's the odd dinner that we have to listen to what each other has to say. I think has a couple of themes running through it. The first one is the value of dialogue and engaging and hearing what other countries have to say on matters that are on our agenda. The second issue is that we would all be either small or medium-sized economies and countries. And because of that, there is also value in hearing what we all have to say. And thirdly, we are all countries that are highly open with a focus on particularly the export of services. And because these are areas that are going to be so important in the European Union, it's helpful for us to hear each other's ideas. But again, I'd like to emphasize that I have far more in common, and all members of that group have far more in common with all other members of the European Union than we will ever have in difference with each other.
That sounds very nice. So let's make this...
You forgot one thing to explain to the public here or the audience, that Black Zero is not a whiskey shipped by the Hanseatic League.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the clarification, Minister Scholz.
If I could just add to what Nadia and Olaf said about their two particular points, because I think they made really, really important points in the debate in relation to expenditure. I mean, Nadia talked about the social challenges that she's referring to in Spain, and it's very similar to Ireland. And I think when we measure a country purely by its macroeconomic success, which is deeply important, we also need to remember that three of us are ministers for economies that are inside democracies. And we have to maintain consent and support for our economies and how they are led and how they are managed. And I think then what Olaf said about the need for investment and the way he needs to manage that within his economy is just a sign now of the shared agenda that we all have and the need to be able to show that macroeconomic success or stability is capable of making a difference to the lives of those that we all represent. And I think that's a really welcome development in how we are thinking about the management of economies at the moment.
And how would that translate into concrete policy?
I think there are two areas in particular. The first one we are already engaging on, which is the management of capital expenditure. And again, the issue that Olaf raised there, that frequently we have debates about increasing capital investment at times of either high unemployment or low demand within our economies. And we are now having a debate about increasing capital investment in many economies that already have high levels of employment. But I think the first tangible sign of the change is the debate in relation to climate, investment, pardon me. And then I think the second area will be the awareness now of the real importance of earnings and the share that they have as a share of national income. And under Mario Centeno, who's the president of the Eurogroup, we've had a number of discussions now about looking at the status of earnings within the Eurozone, the share that they have of European income, and again, what is the consequence of those for citizens and those that we represent. And I think they're very clear signs of a different debate in relation to our economies at the moment.
Right. Thanks for reminding us of the nexus between our economic stance and the way democracy functions. Sabine, Weyand, I wanted to broaden the scope even further. You were really the mastermind behind the EU's Brexit negotiations. You were helped by this French gentleman. And now with Brexit, I think for all intents and purposes, the EU loses a significant share of its GDP. I think it's 15% or so. How do you think does that affect the EU's position as a global geo-economic actor with, a number of challenges ahead?
Well, I think, first of all, it's true that Brexit is a negative, first of all for the UK, but also for the EU. And I think the response has to be, if you lose weight, you have to build muscle. And that means that the EU has to pull together its various instruments and act as a more joined-up actor by putting together its industrial policy, its finances, its trade policy, its research policy, in order to assert its own model of economic development, our own brand of social market economy, in a global context where this is increasingly contested. So I think Brexit reinforces the need for the EU to strengthen itself. And I'm quite hopeful, if I look at the way that we've been able to work as EU27 in the Brexit context, that the strength we take from that unity can also be translated into other areas where we face also challenges to the EU. And I'm talking here about the trade environment that we face. We are in a situation where the international economic order, as we have known it for the last 70, 80 years, is under threat. It hangs by a really by a thread. And I think here we really have to see what can we do, how can we bring our weight to strengthen our global leverage. And we have to hold our own vis-à-vis the US and China, which pose different challenges, but both pose challenges to us. And I think the priorities of the incoming Commission reflect an awareness of these challenges. It will not be easy, but I think we have the elements to assert ourselves more in this world, which is increasingly dominated by a power game.
Right. And on building up muscle, I wanted to come in on the issue of a possible EU-US trade agreement. It seems that President Trump is going to delay his decision on car tariffs and auto part tariffs until sometime mid-next year or so, which coincides with the peak of the presidential campaign in the US. Sounds a bit ominous to me, but still, do you think that a zero tariffs deal that was on the agenda at some point, is that going to happen, or do you think it's a lost case?
I think at the moment, our priorities have to be saving the multilateral trading system. And we need to work with the US to do that. We cannot save the WTO against the US. We need the US with us in this. And I think what we have to manage is a triangle where, in order to save the multilateral trading system, because we want to trade on the basis of the rule of law and not on the basis of the law of the jungle, which is increasingly the case now if we look around us, in that case we have to work with the US to reform the WTO in a sense that creates more disciplines on China in terms of industrial subsidies, because we see the distortions that are created by Chinese state capitalism. At the same time, we need to convince the US that the only way to integrate China in a sustainable manner into the world economy is through strengthening global rules and not through unilateralism, which we see doesn't really produce results. So I think we need to manage that triangle, WTO, US, China, as a priority. In order to do that, we also need to have a positive bilateral relationship with the US. But I think we are not in a situation where we will immediately revive the TTIP negotiations. which failed well before President Trump came into office. But what we see there is that we do not have enough of an agreement about a global package of a trade deal. And we have a mandate to negotiate a reduction to zero of industrial tariffs following the Juncker-Trump meeting last year. But what we see is that on the US side, there's not really much appetite to go for a lowering of tariffs. Tariffs have only one way to go, and that is upwards. So our offer remains, but there are no takers at the moment. In the meantime, we also think that there are other issues we can work on together, on regulatory issues, on standards for emerging industrial sectors. So there is enough of material to have a positive agenda. And that is what we are trying to move forward, but it is not without its difficulties. At the same time, we also have to recognize that we have trade disputes, like on Airbus Boeing, on the US unilateral measures on steel and aluminium, and these are all issues where we have made proposals on how to settle them, and where we are hoping that we can engage the US administration.
This sounds as if we're in for a pretty troublesome 2020 on that front. Minister Scholz, China was mentioned a couple of times, and some of us still remember a former German chancellor who would, pound on his rostrum in the Bundestag and exclaim, China, China, China. And he was probably right. China has become the most important trading partner for Germany, which carries a lot of opportunities, also a number of risks and liabilities, as we can study these days. Now, with this in mind, where do you see Europe in that rivalry, that geo-economic rivalry between China and the US? Is it the grass that gets trampled when the two elephants fight, or is it maybe the third dog that runs away with a bone while the two others are fighting?
Sometimes it's a bit difficult to keep into the pictures. So let me just start from another point. I think we should think 250 years back from today. Back from today. And if we remember that this was a completely different world, where nearly 20% of GDP of the world was coming from China or from India, this gives us possibly an advice for the future. So some years from now, I think we will have a completely similar situation to the world of 250 years ago. And China and India and Indonesia and Malaysia and Japan and Korea and South Africa and Brazil possibly will be big countries of this world. We never should forget that Nigeria will have nearly the same number of inhabitants in 2050 as we have in Europe. And so the question we are tackling today is how to get adjusted to this situation. And the answer is, in a way, that we have to keep our big transatlantic partnership with the United States as being part of the West, which is not just Europe and the United States, it's also Japan and Australia and New Zealand and so on. But it is something very special. And we have to understand that in this world, it is just possible to have a common future or a common security, or to say it with the words of the 70s, or to be multilateral. And so I'm not afraid of this new world to come up, but I think we have to be very clear when we do our politics today to understand this situation. And referring to what I'm saying is, the answer is we need to increase the strength of the European Union. And this is where Macron is right, saying it is about our sovereignty. And this is where we have to think about. It means that we need something which gives us the opportunity to be together in questions which are necessarily something like European public goods. So we need a more combined foreign policy. And this means that we will have majority votes in the Council. We need a more coordinated financial policy, so we need, to my point of view, majority votes in the Financial Council, which is not traditionally a German position, but I would prefer to move there. I think we have to do something about our common borders. We have to do something on migration. We have to do the necessary things that we have big players in the financial industry, in space industry, in aircraft industry, where we were successful in artificial intelligence. So we need something which is more the things a sovereign state is doing. And this is also where he was right when he says what is a big question for me now for 10, 15 years. We modeled the European Union mostly following the idea of building a market, and to be very honest, not a European market. A place called Europe is part of the world market. And this is not a very political agenda. It is possibly in some cases not the right thing to get the problems. And to come back to your answer, so there is no problem with this new world to come up if we are strong enough and if we are aware that there is something which is an idealistic question that brings us together with those understanding themselves as the West, though they are not just always in the West, but understanding the rule of law, democracy, the freedom, individual freedom, and market economy, social welfare state in a way which all belongs to us and which is something I think many people in the world would like to have, but it is their case to decide. We must be strong enough that no one is producing a situation where we cannot keep it in the world of tomorrow.
A strong plea for a unified West. Speaking of things that are coming up, Minister, I have one final question, which is about domestic politics in Germany. Franz Müntefering famously said that being the SPD chairman is the best job in the world, second only to being Pope. And I wanted to ask you if you already have such a catchy line for yourself.
You know, I am from the Lutheran North. I think that it is a very important task to be responsible for the Democratic Party with the longest tradition in Germany that fought against the German emperor and built a democracy when it was not supported by many other people, that worked for social democracy in a way that there is a respect for the workers and their rights and the things they need, and which was always pro-European, to make this point in this field of our debate. And my view is that we all together are in a very similar situation as progressives in the world we are living in. The 21st century is thinking about what will be the outcomes of this so-called second machine age, as a bestseller called it. Digitalization, globalization, they are the words anyone is saying, but they have an impact on our societies. And it is not absolutely clear which path we will take. There is the path of splitting up our societies into very skilled middle-class people and some very rich people on the one side, and an always increasing part of the population which is working for very low wages in very unskilled jobs, and this also tackling the ideas of future of those people who are understanding themselves today as the middle class. And if we want to have something like social cohesion, we must be very strong to avoid that situation. But as the people are a bit, they lose their confidence about the future, and this is why we have all these right populist movements in our countries. You have it, we have it, the Scandinavians have it. What do they have for problems if you look from the perspective of the rest of the world? But they have it, of people being not confident about the future and absolutely not safe. You see the vote, the Brexit, you see the election of Trump. It's always dealing with the same question, that an increasing part of our population is not that sure whether the future will bring good things or not. And it has to do with real questions. Globalization means in a way that 1 billion people in the world is able to do the same as we are. So, not bad. But this means that we must be completely different, successful in economic terms, to be on the same level as we are used to have it, looking at our wealth and social cohesion. And this is the same question if you look at technical developments and digitalization. So my view is the big new question of a social democratic party leader will be, whether we will be able to choose the right path for a future which is more confident, where you can look at, where you are safe that you will be part of it, and where there is no place for populist movements who are just putting people against each other and working with the sentiment and nationalism because they don't have an answer about the questions of the future. But it is us who lose to do the right thing if this would happen. And so this is the big task. And this is not really the task of the Pope.
Not of a Pope. And for a Northerner, that was a pretty long answer, but I found it convincing. Ladies and gentlemen,
I want to run the job a bit longer.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know, the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum is all about interaction. So over to you, to your questions, your comments, also our live stream viewers. You can post questions via the Twitter hashtag Berlin Forum that you also see here on the backdrop. You know the rules of engagement. Please introduce yourselves. Please be as brief and as concise as you can. And remember that every question should end with a question mark. And now over to you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Ricardo Leite. I'm a member of parliament from Portugal, another bailout country. If I may, a word of caution and a question. The word of caution to this esteemed colleague from Spain. In Portugal, we went through a very similar process as the one you are going through now, and the Podemos sister party supported the government over the last 4 years. This led to a strategy of the socialist government that rose taxes indirectly to fuel a rise of public expenditure that is not sustainable. This has given a false sense of economic growth and has transformed our economy into a house of cards, which is unsustainable in future international crisis. So be careful with what you negotiate with Podemos. That's the word of caution. In terms of the question, we are now facing a new age of digital rise, and we have a digital duopoly with Google and Facebook and other players. Some would argue that Ireland has benefited somewhat from this. We've seen erratic and inconsistent responses from different member states on how to respond to this. How should we respond in your opinions? Should we do it at the European level, at the member state level? And what kind of fiscal response is there to make sure that we are getting what is in the people's rights in terms of taxation? Thank you. Thanks very much, Ricardo. Minister Donohoe, maybe that's a question for you.
So I think the appropriate response back to the change in the digital economy is a combination of both the EU-wide response and the nation-state response. I think it is no longer the case to say that we have a digital economy. What we have is an entire economy that has become digitized. And the change in the nature of digital technology, the way that it has percolated through all of our economies, means that the responses back to it need to be multi-layered and perhaps across more policy areas than would have been the case a decade ago. So if I think of what should happen at a national level, I think the responses at national level need to be about education, need to be about making sure that we have the right infrastructure in place, so that as the economy changes in front of us, the acceleration of digitization is not a recipe for exclusion of citizens. And we already have enough challenges in economies and democracies because of exclusion. If that is overlayered with a digital dimension, it could become more challenging. In terms of the work that I think is best done outside of the nation state, the work in relation to the regulation and management of data is clearly best done by countries working together. And the European Union, through the development of GDPR, has led the way in how the balance between the holding of data and the privacy of data can be maintained. And the EU has done that in a way that no individual member state could do. In respect of the taxation of the digital economy, large digital companies do need to pay more tax. and I believe the way in which that needs to be done is through the OECD. And I believe the OECD is the best forum for achieving that, because in order to get to that place, we need there to be a global alignment regarding this being desirable, and hopefully by getting there, avoid a tax issue turning into a trading issue, because we already have enough trade policy issues without generating another one through the taxation of the digital sector.
That point is duly noted. And Minister Calviño, if you wanted to respond to Ricardo's note of caution, now would be the time.
Well, I mean, Mario Centeno could be here to explain to him how successful the policy developed by Portugal these last 2 years has been. Actually, you were saying before that maybe Ireland was the darling of coming out of the crisis. Well, I hear a lot of good words about Portugal actually managing to lead a very responsible fiscal policy together with a socially conscious social policy, and also attracting startups and a dynamic digitalization agenda to the country. So I'm sorry, my assessment of the situation of Portugal is not aligned to yours, but I can understand there are different points of view around the table, of course.
So, more questions, more comments. Yes, please, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Richard Endorfer is my name. I work here for the automotive industry in Berlin. And I have a question. We have been talking a lot about current problems that we have related to foreign trade policy when it comes to China, the United Kingdom, and the US. But if we look a little bit forward into the next 5, maybe 10 years, shouldn't we look especially more into the emerging markets, especially when it comes to Africa, when it comes to free trade agreements due to Mercosur, ASEAN countries, India? Shouldn't this be more on our focus, especially when it comes to the topic that we should actually discuss too, in the trade agreements?
Thanks very much. I see Sabine Weyand nodding vehemently, so...
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't have the time to come to that, but I think one of the priorities, as I said, WTO, our key relations with China and US, but then of course we also need to diversify our relations. And that is exactly as the multilateral trading system is under threat. Trade agreements allow us to have building blocks for a rules-based system that shores up this multilateral trading system. That is exactly what we are doing with agreements with Mercosur, with Vietnam, but we are also negotiating with Australia and New Zealand, and we can see that there is an appetite around the world to enter into these agreements with us and to conclude them. There's a new impetus behind this, whether this is in negotiations with Mexico, with Chile, with Indonesia. We have a very full bilateral agenda, and I think the important thing is that this is not just about opening trade and investment. These are also platforms for multilateral cooperation in favor of global public goods. So we use these agreements increasingly as a platform for cooperating on challenges such as climate change, but also human rights, etc. And this is extremely important in order to have a world based on rules and where it's not the law of the jungle that dominates.
Scholz, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to add one thing more, a wish to the European Commission. It is really a great progress that we have the responsibility of the European Union for trade. Mm-hmm. And it helps all of us in the world, just in a way, as I described before, that we are not just single nations, but acting together. But having a European political strategy or a European agenda on trade in a democratic environment means that there must be debates in the beginning of the talks. Mm. So it always happens again that the national debates about the foreign trade strategy of the European Union starts when the agreements are ready. So we need, and public is key for the acceptance of a political strategy. And so in the last moments when we came to these trade agreements, I had to do a lot to get the support for these agreements in Germany. And I was not the only one, I'm just speaking about me, but I was one of all the leaders who are doing it, and I see it's the same case in all the other countries. What it never happened is a public debate 2-3 years before that when the talks started. And the outcome is that we are always leaving the people a little bit frustrated because they ask us to do something you really cannot do, to stop a process that already finished. And so we have to do something different, and we have to ask you to help us that the debates as a European public starts as a European debate before things are already fixed.
If I may, here I think we have really changed policy over the last few years and drawn a lot of lessons from the TTIP negotiations, where I would recognize that indeed when we had those, there was a disconnect. But since then, we are publishing our draft mandates that we suggest to the member states before they agree them. So they are public. We rely on the European Parliament to also have these public debates at that moment. We are debriefing, we are putting all text proposals we do throughout the duration of the negotiations, we publish them. We do civil society dialogues, European Parliament dialogues. We offer to member states to come to national parliaments as well. It's not always welcomed. And the problem is also that this is a debate which we cannot win from Brussels. It is a debate that has to be carried in the member states. Mm-hmm. And if we as negotiators are the only ones talking about what we are trying to achieve and the benefits, but also the trade-offs we face, we will not win the debate. It is local actors, national politicians, which have more credibility in carrying this debate.
I disagree.
You disagree? Okay. The other thing I wanted to say, perhaps you agree with that, I'll have another go. We have just published a Eurobarometer, a public survey about attitudes, public attitudes to trade. What we see is that 60% see benefits from trade agreements, and 71% of the population in Europe says the EU level is the right level to strike trade agreements rather than national ones. In Germany, the figures are even more positive. But we have a disconnect between public opinion and the debate we have publicly. And that is a problem, because you would not guess that you would have this sort of public support if you follow debates in national parliaments. So I think we have not found yet the way to take the debate into the member states throughout the negotiations. We are trying, as I said, from transparency angle, we are doing a lot. By the way, this is also recognized by the public. The general public does have the impression and realizes that we are doing a lot to be transparent and also a lot to take on board considerations of social and environmental concerns. So the public perception is actually more positive than the public debate. And that is a challenge which we are grappling with, but we have to do it together.
Yeah, once again, if you may allow.
Very briefly.
Because there must be some debate on this table here.
Most welcome.
I really appreciate what you say. I do support it. But it is, I said I disagree on the question who is responsible. Yes, I'm doing things like this. And especially those who are responsible on trade in Germany will do more, I hope so. But to be very honest, when I'm doing things in the European Council, discussing with my colleagues in ECOFIN or in the Eurogroup, it is not exactly what the Prime Minister of Thuringia or Lower Saxony is discussing with his people. He says it's your task to produce and create a German public on questions like this, which I try to do. And this is also due to questions which are just on the national level and are not dealing with European or international politics. So we need something. We need an awareness, I see it because you explain a lot of activities, which is creating European debates, because whether there is no European public discussing right from the beginning about how the things should move, we will never get something which is the necessary legitimation. And this is what I'm asking for, because I'm thinking you are doing quite a good job, and it's necessary that we start from the beginning.
So on that issue of who is responsible for actually explaining those, potential trade agreements to the public, what's your take, Minister Donohoe? I mean, is it the member states who are responsible for winning the hearts and minds of the people, or should it be the Commission in the first place?
I think it's the role of member states have to be at the fore of doing it. And I think but we need to do it in a way that is very consistent with the European project. And each of my colleagues in their contributions have touched on the horizon of insecurity that too many citizens feel at the moment, and how that is fed into political issues that we are dealing with now. And trade and automation are big contributors to that feeling that people have about their future. So what we need to do is we need to explain that the work of Sabine and her team and the work of Commissioner Hogan are part of how we can collectively manage those kind of challenges better than how we could on our own. And that is a contemporary rationale for the European Union. But the communication of that, I believe, has to sit at national government level. Because with all due respect to Sabine, to Commissioner Hogan and to her team, to ask them to conduct negotiations and then to conclude them with the consent of the European Union, and also be the people who negotiate them, who communicate them, when in many cases they are not figures who are known to the national public or the European public, I think is a step too far. And I think this is where the work between members of national governments and the Commission is so important. And just finally, in terms of shared challenges, for example, Nadine and I have gone through when we're managing like economic decisions that have a European dimension, owning the communication of those on national level, I think can be more effective at trying to maintain democratic consent for them.
Right. Minister Calviño, the EU is sometimes seen as sort of the epitome of neoliberal trade and economic practices in some quarters of our societies. So how do you convince those peoples that, yes, we should go for trade agreements, yes, we should work together on a European level?
Well, first, thank you very much, and that's very much the cue comes straight from Paschal and from Sabine. And I wanted to share 3 reflections on what my colleagues have said, but starting with this one, which is we should be a bit more self-assured. Because actually the EU is the largest trading bloc in the world, and we cannot, we wouldn't last for 1 second if we had to negotiate individually, not even Germany. You said it, Olaf. I mean, we need to be together, we need to stick together, and moreover, we have a very recent example of how successful we can be when we stick together. I think that the process that your team led, and Michel Barnier, I have to say, this Frenchman actually has led these negotiations in an excellent manner. This team has conducted these negotiations in a manner which has been very inclusive vis-à-vis the 27 member states. There has been continuous information flow, there has been ownership, and this has led to the unity of the 27, which is undoubtedly the underlying reason why we have been able to succeed in these negotiations and maybe put on the table an agreement which I hope will be subscribed by the British Parliament. But we have, this process shows the way forward, and I think that the more transparency and the more ownership there is between the Commission and the Member States, the stronger we will be in these worldwide negotiations. But let's be clear, I mean, the EU is a trading power, and together we are clearly much stronger. That's my first line. The second line was a reflection made by I think, Olaf, which is the fact that Darwin said those races, those beings that are able to adjust are the ones that will survive. So instead of thinking about the glorious past and, oh, we want to protect ourselves, we have fear, let's adjust to this situation. And undoubtedly being 28 member states, 27 in the future makes us move slower. And I think we all have that frustration that we would like to be able to adjust faster to the new challenges. But okay, this is the way our institutions work. We try to improve them, but let's adjust to the new situation and try to find the middle way, the European way. We don't need to align ourselves to one bloc or the other. We have to find our own way based on our values. I think this is a very important element. And then thirdly, to Pascal's reflections, every day I get this question about blocs. Are you with Germany? Are you with Italy? Are you with Ireland? Are you with the Netherlands? Are you with, everybody wants to put things in black and white, as if we were constantly divided, and as if there were no fluid lines between the positions of the countries. And the reality is that we are very much aligned on maybe one issue, and we may disagree on another one, and then we sit down, we discuss, and we find an agreement, which takes much longer than we would like, but it also makes us stronger, you know. So I think that the fact that there are some countries that get together and have one view of the world, and then other countries may be aligned on another issue, should not be construed to be blocs fighting each other, but rather the diversity of Europe that at the end of the day has allowed us to adjust throughout history and will continue to make us succeed, I think, in the future.
But there is no denying that there are different fiscal cultures within the EU, no? There are no denying that there are different fiscal cultures within the EU, even though, you know, we may not like the formation of blocs.
Yes, but what I think we have to avoid is the idea that each of these positions is always aligned and it is totally opposed to the view of the rest. I think that Pascal's point was very much that one, that maybe on one issue I am more aligned with Pascal than with Olaf, and in another issue I may be more aligned with Olaf than with Pascal. And that is what builds Europe, you know, that we are able to find the middle ground and to find the way forward together, despite the fact that we may be coming from very different fiscal cultures or histories, you know. And I think we should really avoid this kind of black and white kind of approach to the issues, because frankly, none of the challenges ahead are easy. These are very complex issues. And as you know very well, and I think we all have learned in our countries, there is always a very simple solution to a very complex problem, which is absolutely wrong. So, you know, none of these issues are easy to tackle and can be solved by a yes or no. We will have to work very, very much and very intensely together, and we will have a long nights ahead to try to find the solutions, you know. But at the end of the day, what we do will be stronger because it has also gone through the filters of the different cultures. I think that we have to make our characteristics our strength, you know, instead of always trying to feel, oh, we're weak, we're not able to adjust. No, we have done it in the past, we will do it in the future again.
That's almost a concluding note, but we have time for one more question, and our colleague over there is next, Jana.
Jana Poljerin, I work for the German Council on Foreign Relations, and I have a question to Mrs. Weyand. Ursula von der Leyen has announced that her commission is going to be a geopolitical commission. So what is the difference then to the political commission we just had, and who's going to implement this concept, and what is kind of the work share between Mr. Borrell and Mrs. von der Leyen, and do the member states buy into this concept?
I think the one-word answer to your question, what makes a geopolitical commission, is Weltpolitikfähigkeit. It's exactly this ability to act in a world where we have different power games going on and where we are the force that tries to preserve the multilateral trading system, an international order which, as I said, is based on rule of law, and where we pull our weight. And the concrete challenge for this incoming commission is that we need to join up much more our internal policies and project them externally. We have the strength of the single market that is our major asset, also on the global stage, also in the geopolitical, geo-economic dimension. And what geopolitical means is that we no longer have the luxury of looking at trade policy as a sort of a preserved area which follows its own economic trading logic, but it is part of a whole arsenal of instruments that we need to deploy because we are faced with partners in the form of the US and China who are able to join up their different policy instruments. And the same is true, so we have to have this integration of our internal policies and look at how we project them on the global stage, but we also need to bring together our external policy instruments. So there will be a role for everyone, but in the end, we also have to see that, especially if you look at China and the US, the decisions are taken at the level of the leaders. So the Geopolitical Commission will have to be carried by President von der Leyen herself, obviously supported by the Executive Vice President for the Economy, as well as by the High Representative Vice President. And I think the way the Commission is set up, should facilitate this sort of integration of our different policy instruments, which will be exactly the muscle we have to build in order to compensate the loss of weight.
Thanks very much. I have a very final task for you, and I'd like to ask you to complement a sentence, and this is the sentence. For me, European sovereignty means, and then 3 dots, and you please finish the sentence. Minister Donohoe.
Citizens achieving more collectively than they can individually.
Sabine Weyand.
It means being able to chart our own course and not having to choose a lane, not having to choose to follow either the US or the Chinese or anyone else's model, but forge ahead with our own.
Minister Scholz.
More politics, less markets.
Okay. You have the final word, famous last words, Minister Calviño.
Oh, this is very challenging. All of the above.
You would have said all of them.
No, but I mean, summing it up, it would be to be able to preserve our values and to preserve the European way of life in an environment which is challenging. And that is probably what it means, that you're able to speak with one voice, that you're able to preserve you have more politics and maybe less markets, to be able to speak and to preserve our way of life, to preserve our values, to find the middle ground, the European way.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for a great panel.